Would you like to learn about an 8-engined flying Soviet propaganda machine? Well, even if you didn't, you're going to learn about it now, comrade. For we have mandatory education of... Oh, bugger me, no, I cannot do that accent. Anyway, let's talk about something utterly bonkers. In the spring of 1934, as Soviet industry began to accelerate under the second five-year plan, Stalin's regime commissioned Andrei Tupolev to build a giant aircraft, the ANT-20, and it was given the name of Maxim Gorky. Intended as an impressive flying display of Soviet industrial prowess, and as a vehicle of mass propaganda, she made her maiden flight on the 19th of May 1934. With a colossal wingspan of 63 meters, or 210 feet, and powered by no less than 8 massive V-12 engines, the ANT-20 was the largest aircraft in the world at the time. But what set her apart wasn't just her sheer size, but her onboard extravagances, all of which were designed to promote the glorious triumphs of the Soviet Union. This included a fully equipped film projector and darkroom, a pneumatic tube mail system, a telephone exchange, an immensely powerful radio broadcasting system, and even a printing press which was capable of churning out 10,000 leaflets per hour. The Maxim Gorky was indeed a flying example of the triumphs of the Soviet Union. But, and oh boy, is this a big, thick, curvaceous but, her story would also perfectly encapsulate everything that was wrong with the Soviet Union during her time as well. You see, the Soviet Union in the 1930s was an interesting place, and by interesting I of course mean terrifying and chaotic, and this is reflected in the history and events surrounding the Tupolev ANT-20. The man who originally proposed its creation was arrested as an enemy of the people in December 1938 and shot in 1940, for reasons that may or may not have involved the wife of the head of the NKVD, a fun matter which we will discuss later. Its chief designer Tupolev had a similar fall from grace, although one not related to adultery, but he escaped execution and merely spent a few years in a Soviet prison factory. The same could not be said for many of his fellow engineers who met far grislier ends. Even the Maxim Gorky aircraft itself did not survive the dark years. During a propaganda flight over Moscow in 1935, just a year after its maiden flight, an escorting aircraft would collide with the Maxim Gorky's wing, sending it and its 44 occupants plummeting into a city suburb, one of the deadliest air crashes of its era. Another improved aircraft was then built, under circumstances as chaotic as the political climate, mind you, but she too had a tragic end, being involved in one of the weirdest airline crashes in the history of the Soviet Union, where the captain's body was found in the passenger cabin, naked. There is something deeply ironic about a series of aircraft designed to show off the technical innovation, reliability, and safety of the Soviet aircraft industry, only to have a survival rate of exactly 0. The history of this machine honestly plays out like a scene from the dark comedy film The Death of Stalin, and if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you watch it. Behind the impressive technological innovations of what was truly a cutting-edge machine for its time was a confusing web of political intrigue, Communist Party machinations, financial fraud, love triangles, and some good old-fashioned political scapegoating. But to fully appreciate the full story of this flying behemoth, equal parts comedy, tragedy, and political thriller, we need to get some additional context. That means we're not just going to look at the history of the aircraft, but the men and women behind it, and the complex series of events that steered its fate. And that means we have... Yes, what is it? Hang on, the taxation office. Kevin, you did log our financial expenses for the last quarter, yes? What do you mean? What do you mean airfix kits don't qualify as a business expense? Have they seen a 124 scale Lancaster? Its morale boosting qualities? It's... Oh my god, that is a scary number. Okay, we owe that much, do we? Well, bugger me, I guess that is the museum tour dead in the water. That's going to be fun to talk to the patrons about. Oh, a solution, you say? Well, why didn't you start the bloody conversation with that? What is your grand solution? Oh, sweet salty Leviathan. Oh, that's right. This aeronautical history video is indeed sponsored by World of Warships Legends, because boats need love too. This is a massively multiplayer, team-based, free-to-play console and mobile game for those who love their boats and blowing up other people's boats. What do you mean ships? They float, it's the same thing. Shut up, Kevin. Join over 8 million players and take command of over 400 ships from 11 different nations with over 100 commanders across more than 20 unique and beautiful maps in a cornucopia of naval content. No matter what sort of captain you are, cautious, brash, calculating, or inebriated, hey, I'm completely sober, you, there's bound to be a ship for you. Now, of course, owing to the nuances of naval combat, this is not your usual run-of-the-mill competitive game. You cannot 360 no-scope a Yamato, it's got 16 inches of armor for goodness sake. You've got to sync it with strategy and cunning, or some monstrously heavy torpedoes. It also helps if you play in a team, something that World of Warships Legends encourages. You can engage in fast-paced 9 vs 9 PvP battles, or brawl it out in the chaos of 4 teams of 3. Whatever way you prefer, all of the maps have been adapted for swift engagements with a focus on high-intensity combat, and you get to enjoy all of this from the comfort of your own home, or, for that matter, anywhere where you might get an internet connection. You see, World of Warships Legends takes full advantage of the power and capabilities of consoles and mobile devices. So, whether you have a PlayStation, an Xbox, iOS, or an Android device, you'll get to enjoy this game with full cross-platform capabilities. The game is constantly receiving updates, and there are regular themed events. Currently, as part of the Independence Day event, you can get some swanky American-themed camouflages, and if you take part in the free Beureau project, you have the chance to get the hybrid Battleship Louisiana as a reward. Because who wouldn't want a carrier with 16-inch guns as well? I mean, that's just a winning combination. Ah, but Rex, our glorious leader, how do we gain access to this repository of naval wonders? Well, fear not, simply scan the QR code that's been floating around the screen, or click on the link in the description below, and you can sign up to World of Warships Legends today for free. Right, thanks to our aqueous friends, we are now awash with funds, which means that the budget for this video about a flying beacon to communism has been aggressively expanded, admittedly by the powers of capitalism, but we'll just gloss over that. Roll the tapes. Okay, I've had my fun and games now, enough with the memes, let's actually get stuck into this. The origins of this giant aircraft began in 1932 with a journalist by the name of Mikhail Koltsov. Being a journalist during Stalin's time was a high-risk, high-reward occupation, to put it mildly, but this was an environment in which Koltsov thrived, until he didn't, but more on that particular point later. Born on the 12th of June 1898, Mikhail Efimovich Koltsov initially pursued a medical education before turning decisively towards journalism and revolutionary politics. By 1917, Koltsov was an active participant in the Russian Revolution, joining the Bolsheviks in 1918. He served with the Red Army in the following Civil War, gaining both his revolutionary credentials and a reputation for ideological zeal. After Lenin's death, Koltsov rapidly integrated himself with Stalin's inner circle. Contemporary accounts describe him as the confidant and mouthpiece and direct agent of Stalin, with the dictator's personal support helping him become more and more influential. By the early 1930s, Koltsov had become arguably the most famous journalist in the Soviet Union, celebrated for satirical essays that exposed bureaucratic absurdities while stopping just short of undermining the regime. He founded and edited widely read magazines, such as the satirical magazine Crocodile, and he sat on the editorial board of Pravda, the official newspaper of the Central Committee, earning a reputation for prose that was as entertaining as it was ideologically sound. His influence was such that when, in 1932, he suggested the construction of the world's largest aircraft to celebrate the life and work of the Soviet Union's greatest writer, the proposal was accepted out of hand. The famous writer in question was Alexei Maximovich Peshkov, more commonly known as Maxim Gorky, and 1932 marked the 40th anniversary of his writing career. Now, in the Soviet Union, Maxim Gorky was a big deal. Born in 1868, Gorky rose from orphaned hardship to become one of Imperial Russia's most celebrated authors, earning his reputation through vivid, sympathetic portraits of society's outcasts in works like Lower Depths, which was published in 1902, and Mother in 1906. A self-taught man with a gift for naturalistic storytelling, he pioneered what would later be called socialist realism, using literature to champion the proletariat and expose the injustices of Tsarist Russia. By the 1910s, Gorky was probably the most famous Russian writer alive. Following the revolution, he was revered by the Bolsheviks as the father of Soviet literature. He was invited back from exile by Lenin himself, and he then retained a close, if sometimes uneasy, relationship with Joseph Stalin. His works provided moral justification for the revolution, and his persona, as a voice from the people, lent cultural weight to the new Soviet state. Or, in other words, he was a propaganda goldmine. Now, solemn celebrations of this great writer were all well and good, but Koltsov, who always had a flair for the dramatic, felt that something grander should be done for this 40th anniversary. He and several other journalists had been reporting on the steady and impressive growth of the Soviet aircraft industry. In the span of just a few short years, it had gone from an underutilized, undersupplied shambles, forced to rely on foreign, disgusting capitalist imports, using American engines, it's enough to make the peasantry weep, to an industrial power that could stand next to its Western rivals without discredit. To truly cement its place as a leader of aeronautical industry, Koltsov and his supporters proposed that the Soviet Union design and build a truly massive aircraft, one which would dwarf anything flown by the West. It would be financed by funds raised by the people, gifted to the state in honor of Maxim Gorky's works, and serve as a flying example of the ambition and capabilities of the Soviet people. This, in turn, would kill three birds with one stone. They would unseat the record holder of the world's largest aircraft, the German-built Dornier DOX. They would have a propaganda tool unlike anything seen before. And they would do it in a way that wouldn't cost the Soviet government a single ruble. Perfect. Thus, the bureaucratic wheels began to lurch into motion. A national committee for the design and construction of the new aircraft was formed, and in late 1932 a large public subscription fund was announced, with fundraising campaigns across the entire Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the task of design and construction was assigned to AGOS, the Department of Aviation, Hydroaviation, and Experimental Construction, a design and manufacturing division of the Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute. AGOS was headed by Andrei Tupolev, who by now was the leading name in Soviet aeronautical engineering. Tupolev was particularly caressed because he had pioneered much of the work in all-metal aircraft design within the Soviet Union. He was also the most qualified person for the task of managing the construction of this new and massive machine, having overseen the development of the Soviet Union's first heavy bomber, the TB-1, and its much larger successor, the TB-3. Indeed, Tupolev was deeply engrossed in the development of a new heavy bomber, the experimental and massive six-engined ANT-16, also known as the TB-4, when the National Committee selected him for the task of building their giant aircraft to honour Maxim Gorky. The timing was convenient. Along with designing the ANT-16, Tupolev had been working on a civil variant that would serve as a large passenger aircraft, the ANT-20. Further work on this particular design was abandoned due to the Maxim Gorky project, but many design elements were borrowed or adjusted to be used in the new aircraft, and the designation of ANT-20 was transferred over to the new design. At Tupolev's design bureau, a team of specialists would manage the design and construction of every major assembly and system. This team included Vladimir Petliakov, who served as Tupolev's deputy, A. Arkhangelski, who was the director of the design team, B. M. Kondorsky, who was the design manager, V. N. Belayev, who was responsible for testing airframe stressing, N. S. Nekrasov, who was responsible for the mechanical equipment, E. I. Pogosky, who was responsible for propulsion, and A. A. Yengibarian, who was responsible for electrical equipment, and I apologize if I pronounced any of those names incorrectly. Overseeing them all was Chief Engineer Boris A. Sauke. By January 1933, the technical requirements were finalized, and just 3 months later, the draft design underwent its first review. The initial proposal was essentially a scaled-up version of the original ANT-16/ANT-20 design. It had a staggering wingspan of 63 meters, the largest in the world by a good margin, and it was to be powered by 4 high-power V-12s that were being developed by Alexander Mikulin. However, not long into the design phase, it became apparent that the new engines would not be available in time. Sources conflict on what the original specs were, but they may have been a very, very early iteration of what would eventually become the short-lived Mikulin AM-35. Instead, the design was modified to accommodate 6 engines of a lower power output, these being the Mikulin AM-34, a 46.9-litre liquid-cooled V12. These supercharged engines produced approximately 900 horsepower each, and were identical to those equipped on the ANT-16 prototype. But, following the ANT's poor performance in flight trials, it flew like a lethargic duck, Tupolev was very quickly persuaded to increase the engine count to a total of 8, and this necessitated the reintroduction of a tandem push-pull engine mount in a nacelle that was high above the central fuselage, something that was mounted originally on the ANT-16 design, but had been removed for the initial ANT-20 design in favour of 6 engines in the wings. This large collection of engines gave the MG, as it was often referred to, a combined power output of 7,200 horsepower, with each engine driving 4-metre 2-blade wooden propellers. This, along with the increased wing area, was hoped to bring the MG's takeoff run to around 300 to 400 metres, compared to the much longer 800 metres of the ANT-16. Though designed to be a vehicle of Soviet propaganda, the ANT-20 was also presented, on paper, as a versatile aircraft that could fulfill multiple roles. The design team drew up plans for a passenger-carrying variant, which could accommodate upwards of 50 people. It could also be configured as a heavy transport, a bomber with an impressive 10-ton payload, or it could be outfitted as a mobile headquarters for the most senior members of the party, sort of like a 1930s version of Air Force One. It's unclear how many design drawings and proposals were ultimately put forward, as records are a bit sketchy, but what is crystal clear was the pressing need to get things done as quickly as possible. The actual design phase was incredibly rapid, with all other projects being put aside to make the Maxim Gorky a priority. So great was the drive to make the Maxim Gorky a reality that just 2 months after its first formal design review, construction of the aircraft began on the 4th of June 1933 at Factory No. 22 in Moscow. It was funded by approximately 6 million rubles, which had been raised by the public in well under a year. This was a huge sum of money for a populace that was, at the time, especially poor. Despite the fact that this aircraft was beyond anything yet attempted, its construction progressed smoothly and rapidly, and it was ready to fly in just over 10 months. This was all the more impressive when you realize that, in typical Soviet bureaucratic fashion, upwards of 6 different state bodies exercised some level of oversight, and often with overlapping or even contradictory authority. There was, as mentioned earlier, the All-Union Committee for the construction of the propaganda aircraft. This was chaired by A. Garanov and fronted by Mikhail Koltsov. This committee approved designs, managed fundraising, and signed key contracts. From the technical and design perspective, there was, of course, the Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute, which is often known by its acronym of SAGI. This was tasked with the overall technical design, research, and development. Then, operating within SAGI was OKB 156, Tupolev's own design bureau. They produced the detailed airframe and systems blueprints, subject to both All-Union Committee approval and ministerial review, and they would work directly with the factory that produced the aircraft. When things got to the construction phase, more names and acronyms entered the ring. You had the factory itself, which was State Aircraft Factory No. 22, which had its own claim to oversight, though much smaller. This plant undertook the ANT-20's jigs, the metalwork, engine installations, and final assembly. Its directorate answered to multiple state bodies, and to Tupolev's design bureau as well. You also had the Central Institute of Aviation Motor Development, known by the acronyms of either CIAM or TSIAM. Founded in 1930, this was the USSR's sole dedicated engine research and certification center at the time. It developed and tested the Mikulin power plants that were destined for the ANT-20. And overseeing the lot, you had the People's Commissariat for Aviation Industry, or NKAP. This was the government ministry responsible for allocating manpower, materials, and factory space for both airframe and power plant production. Now, usually, a lot of the people in these organizations were at crossed purposes, to put it mildly. Tensions were building between SAGI and Tupolev's design bureau, the former feeling threatened by the ever-increasing autonomy of the latter, which was meant to be a subordinate organization. The Commissariat for Aviation Industry was, in theory, meant to allocate new materials and manpower across facilities fairly. In practice, local factory managers and NKAP officials each had their own quotas, leading to constant negotiations and occasional standoffs over steel, engines, and skilled labor. However, the ANT-20 was, for its time, a unique case. From the moment the All-Union Committee signed its agreement with SAGI, the ANT-20 was treated as a prestige project, above ordinary factory quotas and day-to-day rivalries. In a rare moment for Soviet industry at the time, in the 1930s, there really was unity, and not just the happy illusion of it, and the result was one of the most remarkable aircraft ever built. When it rolled out of the factory in April 1934, the ANT-20 unseated the Dornier DO-X as the largest aircraft in the world. It had a length of 33 meters, a height of 11.25 meters, and a truly massive wingspan of 63 meters. Now, for comparison, the ANT-20's wingspan was more than twice that of an Avro Lancaster or a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. It was wider than that of a B-29 Superfortress, a B-52 Stratofortress, Heck, it was even wider than early models of the Boeing 747 and 777. This thing was massive. If you leave aside prototype aircraft, of which only the Douglas XB-19 is really a contender, the ANT-20's wingspan would not be exceeded by a production aircraft until the Convair B-36. Now, the details of its construction are as fascinating as its dimensions are impressive. And of course, this is the fun part of the video where I talk about the aircraft's technical specifications, hopefully within reason, before we go on to the insanity of its service history and the fun events that followed. The airframe was all metal, with a corrugated skin of 0.3 to 0.8mm in thickness. The wings, though enormous, were similar in style to Tupolev's earlier designs, except for the rounded wingtips, which were new. The wings were formed in two sections. The central section crossed the fuselage with a total span of 10.6 meters, and held the innermost pair of engines. The central wing had a chord of 11 meters and an untapered leading edge. It was supported by 3 braced spars set 2 meters apart, and then crossed with ribs every 2 meters. This separated the inner wing into usable compartments, each of which had a ceiling of 2 to 2.5 meters high. Yep, you heard me correctly, the wing was 2.5 meters thick at its thickest point. She was a chunky thing. This section was joined to the outer wings, each of which tapered on both the leading and trailing edges down to 3.2 meters at the final rib, which met the rounded wingtips. Each outer wing housed 2 more engines and had a span of 26.18 meters each. To facilitate transport by rail from the factory to the testing airfield, the wings could be broken down into 10 sections. 10 A-ribs, interspersed with L-sections, were supported with span-wise stringers constructed of Warren girders. Fully assembled, the enormous wing had an aspect ratio of 8.2, which for the time was on the high end for any wing design, and it was the first time that such a ratio was used on such a large and heavy aircraft. Like some other giant aircraft of the era, the wings of the ANT-20 were thick enough through most of their span to allow access for flight engineers. This allowed for the inspection of the 6 wing-mounted engines, as well as the multiplicity of fuel and oil tanks. The engineers also had their own private little cabins. The aircraft had 3 in total. One was on each wing, and another on the fuselage under the overhead nacelle. These contained vital instruments for monitoring the state of the power plants, and the wing cabins even featured windows as well as access hatches to get onto the upper wing surface. Needless to say, when they weren't busy inspecting all the various systems, the flight engineers in the wings probably had the most interesting view out of any member of the aircraft's crew. Unsurprisingly, an aircraft as large as the Maxim Gorky required very large control surfaces, if it wanted to do anything more than lumber along in a straight line. Experience with the ANT-16 prototype, or as I like to call it the baby Gorky, highlighted the need for the ailerons to be made out of 4 separate sections to avoid the hinges bending as the wings flexed. Combined, these sections made for a truly massive aileron, but unfortunately there seems to be no verified data on their exact dimensions. But having looked at various photos and drawings, they appear to have a span of something between 21 to 25 meters. And to convert that into Western sizes, that's an aileron with the same span as something like a B-25 Mitchell, or perhaps just a tiny bit smaller. Needless to say, they were big. The tailplane was similarly massive, with a span of 18.3 meters. Each of the inset elevators had rounded tips, a first for Tupolev, and electrically driven trim tabs, as did the rudder. As mentioned earlier, power was provided by 8 McCoolin M34s, each producing 900 horsepower. The wing engines were installed on special mounts to keep vibrations to a minimum, particularly important as cabins were being built into the central wing section. These were fed by 9,400 litres of fuel, which was housed in 28 duralumin tanks. These tanks were arranged in groups of 4 and 8 in each outer wing, and they were fed through a collector tank on each side. All of this was supported by a huge undercarriage with 4 main tyres, each 2 meters in diameter. Now, these were originally meant to be enclosed in aerodynamic trousers, but they were later enclosed in enormous spats instead. The cast-ring tailwheel itself was also large, with a 900mm diameter. Entry into this Leviathan was primarily via a novel design, where a hinged section of the fuselage would be lowered, turning into a staircase connecting the ground to the machine. More standard doors were also available on each side of the trailing edge, but these were considered more of a backup than a primary entry-exit method. Now, moving on to the fuselage, and it's here that I have to give a quick disclaimer. Sources vary dramatically on the details of the internal layout and the floor plan of the Maxim Gorky. As such, the following information should be accepted with a fair pinch of salt and not treated as hard facts. Sort of like the way that aero engine power was being reported in the Soviet Union at the time. Yes, this engine does produce 1300 horsepower. Oh no, the reports of fires and melting turbo superchargers are highly exaggerated. Now, come over here into this unmarked staff car and sip a glass of vodka. Anyway, the fuselage was the same height as the wings at the root, which was 2.5 meters, and it was 3.5 meters at its widest point. The front of the fuselage was dominated by an impressive panoramic view of bird-proof glass windows, for what was originally designed to be the chief navigator's station. This is featured in many of the drawings of the Maxim Gorky. However, at some point following completion, this view was given over to a VIP room with 6 total seats. The navigator, meanwhile, was relegated to a small room to the rear of the aircraft. Apparently, disappointing important party members was more of a concern than the risk of getting lost. Who figured? Behind this was a 2-floored section. The upper floor contained the enclosed cockpit with stations for the pilot and co-pilot, and the lower floor had a seating area for 8 passengers as well as a radio cabin. Filling the remainder of the 109 square meter floor space in the fuselage and wing sections, the Maxim Gorky was outfitted with what amounted to a mobile propaganda headquarters / luxury airliner. It had a writer's cabin, a buffet dining area, a cinema projection room, a film library, medium and long-range radio stations, printing presses, a photographic processing room, sleeping bays, storerooms, baggage storage rooms, cloakrooms, multiple toilets, and a switchboard to manage the aircraft's massive intercom system. On top of this, the plane also had its own pneumatic message tube system, which connected the cockpit, the radio room, and the switchboard room. Though an electrical lighting system was installed, many of the rooms also had natural light, which was supplied by large overhead windows. Augmenting this impressive suite, the aircraft had multiple optional equipment setups that could be installed for various special tasks. This included a so-called voice-in-the-sky air-to-ground loudspeaker system, and no, I am not joking, they really did install a series of loudspeakers with the plan to fly this thing above the awestruck peasants, blasting patriotic music and recordings of great Soviet speeches. Honestly, it sounds like something not too far out of place in Command & Conquer's Red Alert game series. It also had the option to install an audio recording system, a pharmacy for visiting poverty-stricken regions, and a leaflet dispensing system. This made use of the onboard printing press that could produce 10,000 leaflets per hour. This allowed the Gorky to carpet bomb far-flung villages with truthful and definitely not exaggerated accounts of the prosperity to be found in the rapidly industrializing cities. No famines here, no sir. Alternatively, much of the built-in equipment could be removed, and this would allow the aircraft to seat 72 passengers. In this configuration, it would have a crew of 8. It was also once equipped with an underwing lamp system that could display slogans at night, turning the ANT-20 into a giant flying billboard, but this was removed early on due to being highly unreliable. Aside from coming with enough propaganda equipment that it wouldn't look out of place in an early 2000s Command & Conquer game, no doubt flown by an outrageously flamboyant air marshal played by Tim Curry,
I'm escaping to the one place that hasn't been corrupted by capitalism. Space!
The ANT-20 featured many technical innovations as well. It was the first heavy aircraft to feature rigid linkages and a variable incidence tailplane with an electric remote system. More notably, it was the first Soviet aircraft with an autopilot system, and the flight and navigation controls allowed it to land at night on unpaved airstrips. All of this was powered by a pair of petrol engine generators, providing both AC and DC power to the various systems with a voltage of up to 120 volts. This too was, for the time, another aviation first. And then, of course, it was the largest and heaviest aircraft in the world. At least for the time being. Alright, hopefully that's satisfied your technical appetites, because I really do want to begin focusing on what the aircraft actually achieved, and the insanity that followed. If you want more technical details, I'll be listing source material at the end of this video. I also suspect we've already hit the 30-minute mark of this video, and the Maxim Gorky hasn't even taken flight yet. So, as mentioned earlier, design and construction of the aircraft occurred remarkably quickly, with the finished machine accepted by the Special Committee on the 24th of April 1934. The Maxim Gorky flew for the first time at Philly Airfield on the 17th of June, with renowned test pilot Mikhail Gromov at the controls. After a 35-minute flight, Gromov remarked at how easy the plane was to handle despite its massive size. At the conclusion of this flight, it was officially the largest aircraft in the world, a title the Soviet Union would waste little time in advertising. Not only was it now the largest aircraft in the world by wingspan, but it was also the heaviest. It had an empty weight of 28,500 kilograms and a fully loaded weight of 42,000. Now, despite this mass and the modest power of the engines, remember they were meant to be 1200-ish horsepower, not 900 horsepower, the Maxim Gorky was still able to achieve a maximum speed of 220 km an hour at sea level and 250 at 5,000 meters. Its standard cruising speed was 195 km per hour, not exactly a blistering pace, but commendable for its size, and it had a service ceiling of 4,500 meters. The Maxim Gorky immediately began filling its intended role. Just 2 days after its test flight, it flew over Red Square to honor heroes who had returned from the Chelyushkin rescue operation. That event had been another demonstration of Soviet air power in itself, where 110 people were rescued from an icebound ship in the Arctic by air. That event also featured Tupolev's aircraft front and center. During the celebratory flyover, the Maxim Gorky's bulk was highlighted to those on the ground by being escorted by smaller aircraft, in this case a pair of I-4 fighters. This practice would become commonplace for the MG wherever it flew, and it did make for an impressive display. Following this, it stepped into its true calling when it was assigned to the Maxim Gorky Propaganda Squadron on the 18th of August 1934. This squadron had been formed back in 1933 for carrying Bolshevik agitation into the most remote corners of the Soviet Union. By the mid-1930s, it boasted over 30 aircraft and even an airship, all bearing the names of sponsoring newspapers, magazines, or unions. But its flagship was always the biggest aircraft the squadron could get its hands on. In the beginning, it was a Tupolev ANT-20, which was basically an ANT-9 passenger transport on steroids, with the wings from a heavy bomber slapped onto it. But this was replaced by the ANT-20 as soon as it arrived. Its sheer size drew immediate attention, making it a huge success for the squadron. The aircraft put on many displays, and there is a surprisingly large video record of the giant 8-engine machine impressing crowds, dignitaries, and even the Grand Dictator Joseph Stalin himself. In action, the squadron would spread out across the towns and rural hamlets, dropping leaflets, screening propaganda films. At one point they planned to project them onto the clouds, broadcasting speeches by Soviet heroes, and staging aerial baptisms, i.e. joyrides, for top-performing workers. And on public holidays, they performed spectacular flyovers above Red Square. In between these propaganda flights, the ANT-20 continued a long and thorough program of ambitious flight tests. It continued to set numerous records, lifting payloads of 10,000 kilos and then 15,000 kilos to 5,000 meters in 1934. Further ambitious feats were supposedly planned, including a payload and range record-setting flight. But in the spring of 1935, the ANT-20's career was violently and foolishly cut short. This is, of course, the part of the story where things begin to go very wrong very quickly. May the 18th, 1935 began as a day of celebration and reward. The official flight tests had concluded, and Sargi's leadership offered a final aerial tour to the engineers, factory workers, and family members who had brought the Maxim Gorky aircraft to life. A line formed at the central airfield. 38 passengers, including 7 children, boarded under the command of test pilot N.S. Zurov and propaganda squadron veteran I.V. Mikhaev, alongside a crew of 9. To showcase her scale, as usual, 2 escort aircraft flew in formation with the Maxim Gorky. On one side, Nikolai Blagin piloted a nimble Polikarpov I-5 fighter. On the other, a 2-seat R-5 reconnaissance plane carried cameraman A. Pulin from the Moscow Military Film Factory. The I-5 would dart alongside the Gorky to dramatize the contrast in size, while the R-5 filmed from above. Now, according to the pilot of the R-5, 1V Rabushkin, the sequence of events unfolded thus. I lifted off first, Blagin followed, then the Gorky. I held position to her left and Blagin to her right. On the second circuit, as the Gorky banked homeward, Blagin opened throttle and attempted a barrel roll, despite explicit instructions not to perform aerobatics. Losing speed in mid-maneuver, his fighter struck the Gorky's right wing near the middle engine, tearing through oil tanks, piercing the wing's corrugated skin, and snapping a main spar. The impact of the collision heeled the great aircraft sharply to starboard. For 10 or 15 seconds, she staggered on momentum and then nosed over. A section of wing tore away, followed by a part of the fuselage and tail, and in a final and grim pirouette, she inverted and plunged into pine trees and nearby houses, her ruptured fuel tanks lighting off a firestorm that destroyed what remained. That evening, Stalin himself convened an emergency Politburo meeting to confirm the disaster and plan the funerals. Andrei Tupolev was conspicuously absent, but through no fault of his own. He was on a research trip to the United States and would not receive the heartbreaking news for another day. The victims, including Blagin, were interred with full honours at the Novodevichy Cemetery. Each bereaved family received 10,000 rubles and enhanced pensions. The official line was unequivocal. Blagin alone bore responsibility. State newspaper Pravda denounced his unnecessary daring and criminal mischief, accusing him of flouting the cardinal rule of piloting, at the helm as in battle. Yet, almost immediately, émigré newspapers suggested a far darker theory, that Blagin had deliberately rammed the Gorky in protest against communist rule. One Polish newspaper even printed an alleged suicide letter in which Blagin vowed to strike down the lazy communist bandits who rode on the necks of his honest brothers and sisters. It was all very shocking and dramatic, the sort of thing you would expect from the time, but these claims collapse under scrutiny. Nikolai Blagin was no crazy, suicidal martyr. He had joined the Red Army voluntarily in 1918, became a party member, and won no small acclaim as a test pilot. His widow and daughter suffered no reprisals, remarkable for Stalin's regime. Instead, they received the same state pensions as the other victims' families. Moreover, when going through his papers, his daughter discovered a written plea to his superiors requesting Blagin's removal from Gorky escort duty so that he could return to genuine flight testing. Hardly the note of a man bent on sabotage. Declassified NKVD files from June 1935 have also added further clarity. In a report to Stalin, NKVD head Genrikh Yagoda detailed how, an hour and a half before takeoff, pilots Zhurov, Rybushkin, Blagin, and the film factory technicians met to plan the flight profile. Although Zhurov cautioned against aerobatics, Pulin and his colleague pressed Blagin to perform figures for the cameras. The investigators concluded that the cameramen, not official orders or Blagin's supposed anti-communist beliefs, were chiefly responsible for urging the fatal maneuver, and they criminally charged the 2 men with causing the crash. Though ultimately it is not 100% certain what the full chain of events were, what is certain is that the crash shocked and appalled the people of the Soviet Union, triggering a massive public outcry. This national grief soon led to unprecedented donations from a public determined to rebuild the aircraft. A staggering 68 million rubles was donated, 10 times the original budget and enough to build a fleet of ANT-20s. But there was just one problem. Nobody wanted a fleet of ANT-20s. The newly formed Aeroflot could barely run a single such aircraft on a profit, let alone a dozen. Moscow didn't need that many propaganda planes, Tupolev had other projects to work on, and, most importantly, the needs of the Soviet Air Force had taken priority in response to a rapidly rearming Germany in the West. However, the money raised and public demand could not be ignored. On the 4th of August 1935, the Council of Labour and Defence formally authorised the construction programme for 16 aircraft. Despite widespread doubt over the economics of such mammoth airliners, their possible military applications, and the absence of suitably equipped airfields or even tractors capable of towing them. Tupolev's design bureau, already busy producing the SB high-speed bomber, was now tasked with the successor project, the design-designated ANT-20 Biz. The major difference between the Maxim Gorky and its successor was in its power plant. The 1200 horsepower AM-35 engines were now available, and these, driving 3-blade constant-speed propellers, gave much greater thrust than those on the Maxim Gorky. This allowed the ANT-20 Biz to use only 6 engines, and so the overhead nacelle to carry the last 2 was removed, significantly improving the aerodynamics. Additionally, there was no longer a demand for its propaganda role, and so the second aircraft was designed purely for civil or military applications. On paper, it was to be a 60-seat airliner by day, and a heavy night bomber or transport by night, complete with bomb racks, an OPB-1 bomb sight, a whole string of defensive turrets, and a powerful intercom. In practice, only the civil variant advanced beyond the drawing board. As Tupolev's Factory 22 was busy with military projects, the task of building these 16 giants was handed over to the brand new Factory No. 124 in Kazan. 2 prototypes were to be followed by 4 machines in the first production series, 5 in the second, and then 5 more in the third. However, the new factory lacked drawings, jigs, tooling, or any trained workers. By the 1st of December 1935, only half of the working drawings and a third of the process charts were complete, and not a single component had emerged from production. And this, my friends, is where things go from bad to chaotic to worse. Numerous factors now came into play that would further delay the production of the prototype and ultimately lead to the cancellation of the entire production series. The result was that only a single ANT-20 Biz would be built, and it was completed almost 3 years behind schedule. Now, the biggest cause of this delay was that, politically speaking, the Soviet Union was going to hell in a handbasket, courtesy of Joseph Stalin's paranoia. Pretty much every important person behind the original ANT-20 Maxim Gorky would be swept up in the purges of 1936 to 1938. This included the 3 men that were key to the Maxim Gorky's creation in the first place. In October 1937, Andrei Tupolev, his deputy Petliakov, and the entire directorate of Sagi was arrested on trumped-up charges of espionage, sabotage, aiding hostile parties, etc. Many of Tupolev's colleagues were executed following sham trials, but he, Petliakov, and a few others were deemed too valuable to completely do away with, and they were merely shipped off to the gulags, a wonderful consolation, I'm sure. Later on, they would be moved to an NKVD prison factory near Moscow, where, under nominal imprisonment, they would produce some of the best Soviet aircraft to serve during the Second World War. Along with them, the man directly responsible for promoting the idea of the aircraft in the first place, the journalist Mikhail Koltsov, was also no longer in the picture. An amorous man and a risk-taker, Koltsov chose to have an affair with a particularly powerful woman, Yevgenia Yazova, the wife of the head of the secret police. Nikolai Yezhov. This was the man who happily and with great zeal orchestrated the prosecution, torture, and execution of his predecessor and mentor, and countless others. This is not somebody you want to irritate nor cuckold. Now, you'd immediately assume Koltsov's fate was sealed in the typical way. The husband discovers the affair, and as the bloody-minded head of the NKVD, he sends Koltsov to have a brief interview with a dozen rifle enthusiasts. But this was actually not the case at all. His wife had a known proclivity to take on many lovers, and although it is unclear if he encouraged it, Yezhov at least allowed it. It gave him personal and political leverage, and maybe an excuse to install wingback chairs in the spare rooms, who knows. Regardless, this gave Mikhail Koltsov a remarkably high degree of protection. That is until Yezhov himself was deposed and arrested. He then threw both his wife and her lover under the bus immediately, saying they had links to British espionage operations. Koltsov's career as a frequently travelling journalist lent wonderful weight to this confession. Long story short, Koltsov eventually died by firing squad on February 2nd, 1940. Even Maxim Gorky himself, for which the aircraft was after all named, did not escape Stalin's ire. Gorky, once a loyal ally, found himself under informal house arrest in his Moscow home, monitored by the NKVD, and deliberately kept supplied with only a heavily sanitized newspaper that omitted any and all mention of the ongoing purges. On the 18th of June 1936, Gorky died, officially of severe pneumonia. At his state funeral, Stalin himself carried the writer's urn, a final and dramatic gesture of honor. Yet almost immediately afterwards, rumors circulated that Gorky had been poisoned on Stalin's orders. Indeed, in the 1938 trial of former NKVD chief Genrikh Yagoda, Yezhov's predecessor, the court even convicted Yagoda of orchestrating Gorky's death. An accusation that remains unproven, but speaks to the murky and fearful politics of the time. So, the man who proposed the aircraft, the man who designed it, and the man to which it was dedicated to, were all either imprisoned or dead. Wonderful. The Soviet Union really wasn't a fun time in the late 1930s. Now, the only remaining person of importance from the original circle of engineers behind the first ANT-20 was Boris Sauke, Tupolev's chief engineer, and it was on his poor shoulders that the task of building this new aircraft rested. As Tupolev himself was no longer in the Kremlin's good books, the aircraft was redesignated to have his initials removed. Now designated PS-124, or Passenger Aircraft 124, and registered as L-760, it was finally complete in May 1939. All traces of the grand propaganda machine had been swept away. The posters championing the triumph of 16 giant airliners had long since been forgotten, and although the PS-124 was still the largest aircraft in the world, it generated far less fanfare, except for the commercial aviation sector. Nevertheless, it was still an impressive machine. 3 passenger cabins held 60 seats arranged 2 by 2 around a central aisle that stretched nearly the full length of the fuselage. The forward cabin sat 10, the middle 16, flanking a radio room and storage, and the aft 8, together with a 6-seat buffet salon beneath skylight windows that bathed the corridor in natural daylight. Behind these lay 4 double sofa sleeping compartments, each with 3 place settees convertible to bunks, complete with fold-away tables, mirrors, and electric wall sconces. Further aft were the auxiliary power units, luggage holds, cloakrooms, and even a small library, plus folding corridor seats reminiscent of something you'd find on a railway carriage. In all, it was actually quite a luxurious piece of engineering. By early May 1939, the PS-124 was ready for factory trials. Though missing undercarriage spats, galley stoves, sofas, and a stabilizer trim actuator, items that would only have added weight, its empty mass measured in at a hefty 31.2 tons. On the 15th of May, test pilot E. Schwartz lifted the 6-engine giant off Kazan's runway. It proved capable of 235 km an hour in level flight and 270 in a shallow dive. The stabilizer actuator was fitted between flights to explore different center of gravity positions, and engine failure simulations confirmed that one or two engines feathered on opposite sides could be handled with only a trim tab correction, though losing two on one wing sent the aircraft into an uncontrollable yaw with heavy tail buffeting. After fitting the undercarriage spats and cabin furnishings, PS-124 was sent to Moscow for state acceptance trials in July to August of 1939. Pilot Schwartz once again took the aircraft up, recording a maximum speed of 275 km an hour and a practical range of 1,000 km. On the 12th of August, it was formally inducted into Aeroflot service. Through late 1939 until December 1940, the PS-124 flew scheduled services between Moscow and Miloranye Vody, 26 return trips in total, carrying some 2,100 passengers, before being laid up as the war loomed. After being left in the elements for over a year, it was restored to service in November 1941. It shifted operations to Central Asia under Aeroflot's Uzbek Directorate. Cargo runs and evacuation lifts soon outstripped passenger duties, and between December 1941 and November 42, it logged nearly 700 flight hours. Considering the dark circumstances of its birth, it seemed that the PS-124 might finally shed the bad luck of its predecessor. However, tragedy would strike once again. On the 14th of December 1942, the aircraft took off from Chadsu. 2 hours into the flight, flying at an altitude of 500 meters, the plane was seen to enter into a sharp dive, and it impacted the ground at an incredibly steep angle of 80 degrees. The impact completely destroyed the aircraft, killing all 10 crew and 26 passengers, but remarkably, the wreckage was not consumed in a fire, as is often found in airline accidents. During a subsequent investigation, it was found that the captain was not at the controls during the accident. His body was found in the passenger cabin, without any clothes on. Instead of being at his station, he seems to have swapped seats with a passenger by the name of Kozlov, who was also a pilot but one unfamiliar with the giant PS-124. It appears as though Kozlov had manipulated the autopilot controls and inadvertently forced the stabilizers into maximum positive angle. Neither Kozlov nor the co-pilot could arrest the steep dive before the plane impacted the ground. Now, I should point out that he may not have even been aware of manipulating the autopilot in this way, as the control for stabilizer trim was located in the most ridiculous place. The button that adjusted said trim was on the armrest of the pilot's chair. He could have nudged it with his elbow, for goodness sake. Now, as much as I really want to go into detail about the circumstances of this crash, I must defer to superior knowledge. A channel on YouTube by the name of Paper Skies has done a fantastic video about the ANT-20 Biz and this accident, and I cannot recommend it enough. Indeed, the presenter has produced several truly amazing videos that are as informative as they are entertaining, and quite a few of them are about Soviet airliners and airline accidents. So do yourself a favour and check them out after we've finished here. With the loss of the second of only 2 airframes built, the story of the ANT-20s was at an end, and neither wreck survives to this day. Although Tupolev had worked on designs for an ANT-20V, a heavy bomber variant, able to carry 10 tons of bombs and defended by an impressive array of 20mm cannons and 7.62 machine guns, the project would never leave the design phase. It was already being overtaken by other projects for faster, high-altitude bombers that were entering vogue, and they too would be superseded by more tactical bombers that the Soviet Union would end up fielding during the Second World War. Questions still surround these giant aircraft today. Chief among them was what actually happened to the rest of the 68 million rubles that were raised for 16 ANT-20 Bizes? The sole example only cost 5.5 million, and, well, your guess is as good as mine, but no doubt several Soviet officials performed some singular financial acrobatics to funnel funds here, there, and everywhere, and by that I of course mean into their pockets. However, despite being few in number and short-lived, the Maxim Gorky was far from a failure. Its success as a propaganda aircraft, though brief, was demonstrated by the public outpouring following the first crash, and during its design and construction, and that of its ANT-16 predecessor, many technical challenges had been overcome, paving the way for even larger and more successful heavy aircraft in the future. But the Gorky's biggest legacy had to be the fact that it was a flying metaphor for the state of the Soviet Union in the 1930s. The ANT-20 Maxim Gorky embodied the Soviet Union's grand ambitions, and the tensions those ambitions created. Financed by roughly 6 million rubles raised from a still impoverished people, the Gorky's rapid construction showcased the USSR's drive for industrialization, even as it navigated oversight from half a dozen overlapping ministries and institutes. Yet its very purpose, as a state-controlled, flying palace of propaganda, mirrored the broader cultural landscape where art and information were tools of the party, and writers, engineers, and designers worked under the ever-watchful eyes of the NKVD. In both its grand scope and sudden end, the Maxim Gorky mirrored the state of its motherland. Vast in scope, relentless in its pace, yet ultimately vulnerable to the very political forces it was built to celebrate. Now, if you want to learn a bit more about the ANT-20 Maxim Gorky and the ANT-20 Biz, I have some books to recommend you. There is a full list of sources in the video description, but I just want to recommend 3 specific books that I have in my collection that I found the most useful when researching for this video. The first is Tupolev Aircraft Since 1922 by Bill Gunston. It's part of the Putnam collection, and I consider this an essential book for anyone who wants to learn about Soviet aircraft and Soviet aeronautical engineering. And indeed, the Putnam collection of aeronautical books is a must-have in general. You also have a book titled Tupolev, the Man and His Aircraft by Paul Duffy and Andrei Kandalov. This book focuses on the man as much as the aircraft that bore his name, and it's a good overview of the entire catalogue of Tupolev aircraft from his first to his last. And in a similar vein, we have my third recommendation, which is OK.B. Tupolev, A History of the Design Bureau and Its Aircraft by Yefim Gordon and Vladimir Rigmant. This isn't just a book that focuses on Tupolev and his aircraft, but it also touches on the general background information that is relevant to Soviet aeronautical engineering, what's been going on with the Soviet government, the VVS, etc. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a big thank you, of course, to the Patreon supporters. Now, you probably won't be surprised when I tell you that this was meant to just be a 20-minute video, but I felt this one really deserved a longer deep dive, and I hope you enjoyed the introductory shenanigans as much as I did. I had a lot of fun making that silly intro credit reel. A big thank you, of course, to our Wing Commander tier patrons, our highest tier supporters, and for those of you wondering, yes, there was meant to be a test livestream this week, but something came up, again. I'm hoping to reschedule it for the coming week, so please keep an eye out on the notifications. I'm probably going to stream on both YouTube and Twitch, alternating between platforms depending on what the stream content will be focusing on. Anyway, that is all for today. Thank you all so much for your continued support and patience. I really, really, really appreciate it, and I will catch you all next time. Goodbye.